Yeah, so I appreciate everybody. Yeah, I appreciate people joining on this webinar today as well. And I think probably several of you were on the Fireside Friday chat a couple of weeks ago, and I did this too. The impetus for doing it now is kind of a backgrounder for Lori's talk next week on the issues that we face with USDA and landfilling carcasses. And so I just wanted to give a background for those who had not been on Fireside Friday. So this is kind of, I don't want anybody to be scared if you saw that there's 86 or so slides. It's really two presentations in one. The first third of the slides really are more of a background on landfills, what they are, how they're constructed, some of the basic information that probably we all that are dealing with this should know. And then the last 2/3 or so of the presentation is really something that can be taken to speak to, so that anybody can go out and speak to landfills, go to your county commissioners, your state departments of agriculture, state EPDs, environmental protection, anyone that you're trying to really solicit for being able to use landfills and mass carcass disposal. So the 2/3 of the presentation that's at the end, that's actually posted on the Fab Prep website that anybody can get to. And you can also contact me and I can give you more information for that. So we'll jump right in. So it's 10 after now. So I'm just going to go through these first 2/3 or this first third of the presentation. And then the last part, I'm not going through every slide. There's a lot of background on there about the HPAI response last year. And then there's just a lot of pictures on that too, so that everyone gets a background on what goes on with that. So what should be my first, it's not advancing, Kenny. Trying to advance. The slide is not advancing.
Well, how about we do this? Maybe.
Let me look at my icons at the bottom. Okay, got it. All right, my little icons were hiding from me. We're good.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I definitely can't see it myself.
Okay, so that doesn't help much, does it? So really, and the introduction that I just gave, we just don't want to be this guy. And yeah, so we don't want to be the one kind of standing there waiting for the roll-off to dump a bunch of trash on us. We want to be prepared. We don't want to get dumped on if we find ourselves in another mass carcass disposal situation there. So for the ones that I know that are on this call, I think I got most of the names on there. We understand why carcass management matters. I think most of us were on the response last year and have been there, whether or not we've been in foot and mouth or something else, some other point, vesicular stomatitis. We understand why carcass management matters. We want to spread, or we want to prevent the spread of disease to help human and animal and environmental health. And then also, I mean, if none of those reasons appeal to you too, we also want to do it so that we minimize our legal liabilities. We don't want to be sued. So when we have these, what could be perceived as unacceptable risk to human, animal, or environmental health, we want to do the right thing so that we can protect USDA and also protect health as well. So a landfill, a lot of people might interchangeably use landfill and dump, but it really is just depositing waste materials in an engineered facility. Landfills will have an impermeable liner, leachate collection system, and gas control system to prevent environmental contamination and scavenger access to waste. So very basic. So how is it deposited? So this was interesting going through and learning it because I kind of came in on the back end of this on landfills. So they're all made up of cells, and each of those cells contains the waste from just one day of disposal operations. The trucks go in, they fill up a cell, compacts it down, and then once that cell is done, then they move on to the next one the next day. You can put a 6-inch layer of soil or other kind of cover material, and that may or may not change from state to state, but I think for the most part, that's about a 6-inch layer of cover material to protect it from the wind, the weather, and other scavengers out there. And then eventually the entire landfill is capped and then monitored for a number of years through a regulated closure process. And that's very involved. And for those of us, especially like in Iowa last year, they wanted assurances. Well, what if 10 years from now, is the landfill still legally liable? So those are some of the topics that Lori's going to get into on her talk next week. But again, this kind of gives you a background on why we have to look at those sorts of things too. So my next slide, the title is landfills. I didn't put numbers on these, so just to let you know. So these do differ from dumps. Again, they've got some kind of liner. It keeps the waste and its decomposition byproducts from polluting the surrounding area. And then they also have a means of evaluating the surrounding environment to make sure that it's not getting contaminated. They have a leachate and gas collection system. And then oftentimes the waste that is collected from that, it can go through treatment or it can be recycled and then also spread back out there throughout the landfill too. Some of the requirements, especially on newer landfills, they have to meet a design and operating standards, and that's based on the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and those are contained in 40 CFR as well, in case you want some light reading one day. So I'm on the next slide, the types of landfills. And I'm waiting a little bit. I understand that there's just a little bit of a delay between slides, but I'm on types of landfills. And basically the ones for our purposes today, we'll talk about those municipal solid waste landfills. And you can see there again, for more reference material, 40 CFR 258, and that's got the federal, and then you've also got your applicable state regulations in there. There are also hazardous waste and then construction and demolition or C&D landfills. And in most cases, those C&D landfills would not accept anything other than construction and demolition debris anyway. So we kind of take them out of the discussion. And then hazardous waste, we don't even want to touch that one as well. So for most purposes, our animal carcass and the waste generated from that would be considered for municipal solid waste. And then this was an interesting picture to me here. It's a cross section of what a landfill would look like on there, and the different recovery systems they have, the cover, the drainage layers, the different caps. They've got wells in there to monitor groundwater. So that's kind of a useful slide there too. If you're trying to explain it to somebody, or if you've just never seen what a landfill, from the road, we just see that it looks like a big mound of trash and dirt and everything else, but it's actually much more complicated than that. So the next slide is on municipal solid waste landfills. And those are most commonly found in most areas of the country. So they would, by nature, those would be the ones that we would most likely seek out to dispose of carcasses. They would have sufficient safeguards protecting the environment. They're relatively inexpensive to use. My understanding is that, of course, like I said, we can rule out the C&D landfills, but then hazardous waste landfills, I think, are just so cost prohibitive. And then that just gets into, so many more regulatory hoops that we would prefer not to jump through if we don't have to. And those are typically these municipal solid waste. They're typically clay or synthetically lined, and then they do have those collection systems. And this picture is just a little bit fuzzy, but again, it's just kind of a good schematic of what those landfills can look like. So the next slide on the state environmental regulatory agencies, I just can't stress this enough, and I think most everybody on this call, when we did this before and probably through other phone calls, this is really your starting point for what you want to find out about landfills, what the regulations are, because beyond the 40 CFR federal regulations, we do have state and local authorities, and they might have additional, in many cases, even more stringent regulatory criteria. And that can be anything from the facility design and operating standards, the permits, permit modification, groundwater monitoring, corrective actions, gray water management, closure. So there can be many more regulations on a state and local level. So that's always a good place to start for these purposes too. So the next slide on the typical design of a municipal solid waste landfill. So these typically are made up of cells, and these are just units that are made up of one day's disposal. Then those are contained within a liner system, and then that has, it protects the trash and the leachate from contaminating the groundwater. And then around this, you've got the stormwater drainage system, which is exactly what it says, collects the rainwater and redirects it so it doesn't get into the cell and make those situations worse in there. It also limits the amount of leachate produced too, for obvious reasons. Then that stormwater is collected, processed, and then when it meets the regulatory standards, it can be discharged. And then you've also got groundwater monitoring wells, and then that's installed around the perimeter of the landfill so that they can, so any contamination can be identified and prevented from spreading to the community, and having that on our hands too. And so then these have pipes that are installed deep into the ground so that they intersect the groundwater, and then they can be sampled and tested for leachate, for chemicals, for appropriate temperature, and for pH. The next slide. So the leachate collection system, it collects the water and any other liquid waste of decomposition byproducts that have gone through the landfill and contains contaminants. It then typically is processed in lagoons, and it's discharged to a treatment plant in many cities, or it could also be recirculated through the landfill. I know here in Georgia that's typically what they do with theirs, but everyone can be different. There's also a gas collection system, and then this is, as we all know, it's formed during the breakdown of trash. And then that gas typically has methane, carbon dioxide, other trace gases, and has, 30% heating value. And then it can either be burned. So you'll see in that picture, there's a flame off of that gas collection system. And in some cases, it can be captured for energy production. And some landfills can even sell that gas as another source of income for their landfill. Next slide. So in the cap and cover system, this is a really low permeability barrier of plastic, or it could also be clay or bentonite or any combination of those materials, and it seals off the landfill so it's not exposed to elements and scavengers over time. So each time this is capped and covered, that's when your daily layer of soil, typically 6 inches, is placed on the cell each day to prevent scavengers from disturbing the waste. And then when the area of that landfill no longer accepts waste, a deeper layer of cover material is placed over the whole cell until the landfill is capped. And again, if you go back several slides and see that cross section, you'll see what that means. It's just a thicker layer on top of that as well. Next slide. And this is that good cross section. You'll see there on the lower right-hand corner, the gas flare that's off there. That's from the gas collection system. That gas could also go off to a power grid somewhere. You do have leachate storage tanks. You've got combustion engines. You've got the groundwater monitoring wells, the different leak collection pipes, the different liners that are on there. And then you've got those different layers of cover system on there. So it was very interesting going through and doing this and learning all about it, because you don't realize how intricate a lot of these landfills are and what they go through just to contain just our regular everyday trash. So many of the advantages and disadvantages, again, for this audience, I think many of us were aware of what we went through last year. I'm sorry that advantages, that little cross through shouldn't be there. So the infrastructure does already exist in that landfill to take large numbers of carcasses. It is immediately available as long as the owner is willing and able to take those carcasses. They do already have those environmental countermeasures in place, such as fences, scavenger control, gas and leachate management. Again, they're found nationwide. And then one of the advantages of landfills too, and that's something that SIA and STOS are both working on too, is that we do, depending on the pathogen, we have possible inactivation due to heat generation and then time that they're in the landfill. You'll see the asterisk on there. There is a report that should be out, and Laura can speak to this as well, on the risk of leachate in a landfill to spreading HPAI, and I believe a mallard duck was used for the standard in that study too. So just to try, last year in Iowa, that was a big problem that we had, is that the landfills wanted guarantees that no, there's no way that they could ever be traced back to them, that AI may have spread from their landfill, and they wanted indemnification. They wanted to really absolve all legal liability for understandable reasons. None of us would want to be in that boat. And so, we understand that there's never 100%, there's never zero risk involved in any of this too. So they're working on that study, and it seems to be encouraging. And so hopefully that'll be out later this year. So while we can't say there's zero risk, hopefully we'll have some scientific backing to go to these landfills and show just the amount of virus that could be contained in leachate after that. And then also some of the other waste products like the gas can be used to also as another means of income for the landfill. And finally, that we can use landfills for other things such as PPE. I think they used that last year in Minnesota. So even if a landfill's not willing to take carcasses, maybe they'd be willing to take broken eggs or liquid egg product, if they can even accept liquids. We'll get to that in a minute. Maybe take some of the PPE and some of the clean and disinfection materials that we generate from a response to. The disadvantages, of course, they may not be willing to accept carcasses, and that's certainly their prerogative. And keep in mind, too, we do have public and private landfills as well. Many of this is when we're talking about municipal solid waste. Those are often the ones run by counties or cities, but then we also do have private landfills like advanced disposal or waste management too. So just to make sure that we kind of intertwine that as well. So owners or operators may not be willing to accept those. There is a risk of transporting disease when we're transporting those carcasses too. In some cases, those landfills, the carcasses in there, they may not reach the temperatures or conditions necessary to inactivate all pathogens. If it's in a colder climate or they're too far around the outside of where that cell is and where they're being collected, they may not be able to reach high enough temperatures. Keep in mind too, this is not really destroying waste, we're just containing it. And then that landfill may already be obligated to accept routine waste, say from their city or county, and just may not have room for our carcasses. The next slide on regulatory considerations. So it's very important on this, on the waste classifications, and it can vary widely in regard to diseased animal disposal versus other products that we may have. And every state or county may have a different waste classification system. It's really, so that's another one that's another reason that we really want to get these state environmental folks on board with us. NRCS is also another really good resource, and they've been working a lot with Lori on this. And many of you too in your individual states, you may be working with NRCS or your own environmental protection too. So talking about waste classification is very important because there's strict consideration before those can be transported. And so where is that waste originally, where is it generated, and then where is it going to be disposed of? And so in some cases, local jurisdictions may also have relevant applicable regulations. Next slide. So that waste classification is a determining factor on whether or not the facility can even accept the waste. And so really what you need to do is just to kind of verify that the receiving landfill will accept that specific type of waste. And again, when Lori goes through her talk next week, I think there is an example of a waste profile sheet in there as well. And that's something that we just want to ensure that we do that. And again, if I got it in red, that means that we want to make sure and do that for legal cover as well. And we're just trying to do the right thing here too. So we want to make sure that we have the proper waste profile sheet for that state or for that landfill, and then it's completed appropriately too. The next slide. So many of these considerations, so in most cases, animal-related waste that would be generated during the response would be considered as a solid waste for disposal purposes. In some cases, they are medical and infectious solid waste. So a portion of that material, such as sharps and needles, those might be subject to different state regulations. So again, that's where you need to check with your state folks on that. There's hazardous materials and then there's hazardous wastes. So if carcasses are moved in commerce, such as on public county roads, the DOT has authority over what's transported on there. Infectious waste, such as carcasses or anything that could cause disease or death in humans or animals, could be classified as a hazardous material, and then they would have to be placed on a special classification from the DOT. If that's the case, they'll have special packaging, a different manifesting system, and then to transport to that appropriate facility to accept the materials. So they would have to be classified separately as hazardous, and that's not the same as hazardous waste under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. I'm going to jump on to the next slide, but Lori, if you wanted to come in here on this next slide, just discussing the permitted movement of using the 127 versus DOT. If APHIS has the primary authority in animal disease outbreak, we could transport carcasses under VS Form 127, which I think is what we did last year when we were in Iowa. And in those cases, then we're required to keep up with the chain of custody, the disposal, cleaning, and disinfection. And so everyone, you just want to work closely with your incident command group, your incident management team that's on site, and especially your state authorities to determine the permissibility of using the 127 versus a DOT form. So Lori, if you wanted to jump in there and clarify some of the DOT versus APHIS.
Thanks, Joanna. I want to clarify, there's an error in this slide. It's not either or, it's both. So if the carcasses are being transported on a public road, then DOT does apply. So that means the carcasses that are generated at the farm may need a permit to leave the farm, and that's under USDA or the State Department of Ag, and a VS 127 may be used for that. Separately, DOT also has rules about placarding and qualifications of the truck drivers and various things that would apply to those haulers as well. So it's not an either or, it's an and.
Okay, so we've got that on there. We've got it's both DOT regulations and when they leave the farm, the 127.
Right. So this slide that's showing now says infected carcasses may be transported under VS Form 127 instead of DOT protocols, and that really is in addition to.
Okay. Thanks.
And I just want to clarify that the DOT protocols are not that onerous. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It just takes coordination, and once that's done, then haulers know how to do that. So.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
All right. So on the next slide, did you want to add anything else? On the waste stream evaluation, different facilities may be only able to process certain materials or not others. So the sooner carcasses are disposed of, the easier they'll be to transport. So as we know, last year from Iowa, 6 weeks in, they were a little bit soupy by that point. But many landfills are not able to accept liquids. So we need to take that into account too when working on the waste profile sheet. So when discussing with your landfills what there is to be disposed of, of course, we want to be able to dispose of carcasses, but if they can't do that, would they take eggs? Would they take liquid egg product? Can they take manure or bedding or litter or any of the clean and disinfection debris as well? And then in what physical state are those materials? So do we have liquids at this point like we did last year in Iowa? Or would they be restricted from accepting landfills? And then in that case, they would need the RD&D to take the liquids per the CFR that's cited right there. And then how much material does need to be disposed of? If there's more material than the local landfill is willing to take, you may have to locate different ones outside of the control zone. And common sense will tell you that you want to try and find a landfill closest to your infected premise, but the closest one may not be able or willing to accept those two. And so that's why having different landfills that are available to take those as well is very useful. And in many cases, they may have to be sent to multiple facilities as the capacities are reached. And last year as well, say if one landfill was 2.5 hours from an affected premise, we also made sure with the incident management team and with DOT and everyone else that they were rerouted around other poultry farms so that we didn't have the risk of spread to those farms as well as they were transporting to landfills. And so then these next few slides, again, for the audience that I believe we've got on here today, these are just some of your response considerations, and many of us lived it and learned it last year. And so just make sure that you keep up with your state and local regulations and that your ICG and your incident management team are in constant communication with your state environmental or NRCS folks in your state that you're responding in. Consider your environmental impacts. And the biosecurity, that's at the farm, during transportation, and at the landfill as well. There are obviously public health considerations. This is primarily based around AI, but as we're starting to branch off into swine and other diseases, FMD, look at your public health considerations. For HPAI, we do have guidance on there that CDC came out with last summer and working with Lori. And it really is, it's the guidance for landfill operators during disease outbreaks with poultry. So again, you can find that on your FAD Prep site, or you can also click on the link in here. And then what's your physical security on site at the landfill? Who all are you going to have out there? Again, in many of these cases, we're going to be using contractors. And then just some of the other the administrative and logistical part, what are your cost considerations? They charge typically what's called a tipping fee, and that can either be based on weight or by volume. But, the landfills, they may very well charge higher rates for infected agricultural waste and for the extra infrastructure that they may have to put in to accept these carcasses. And then what additional materials or supplies or equipment may be needed. Again, working with your IMT, with logistics, and then with your contractors on this. Is your PPE, who provides that to the landfill? Do they provide it? Do you guys provide it? Are we making sure that we've got that secure transportation based on both APHIS and DOT protocols? Your cleaning and disinfection of the vehicles as they arrive there, and then again when they're leaving the landfill. Disinfection of the roll-offs and the vehicle liners and the tarps that go on top of them, the loading equipment, and then your absorbent material to keep any of that fluid from leaking. You want to have we've got regulations on that too, or standard operating procedures on how much you need to have at the bottom and how much headspace to have at the top. What kind of approved containers would you have for that? Are you going to use these biozip bags like we did last year, something else? We've got containers. Pretty much they just look like a vault. And then also your sharps containers from that response too. And then just making sure that you've got the proper permitting and movement documents as well. Your next slide. Oh, sorry, that text box showed up in there. So finding landfills in your state. If you guys have never been to this website too, this is really useful. I believe it's an EPA website, Lori, if that's right. But you see the links on there too. And again, if you've got the PDF, you can email me and I can send it to you as well. But for this, you can ask for a user ID and password. And then you can choose a different kind of treatment and disposal facilities that are on there. And you just choose it by your state. You can either find incinerators, landfills, rendering. And then you can also enter it by your state or EPA region. So this is a really useful tool to have at your fingertips as well if you have not seen that site before. The next slide. So the preparations at the landfill, you do all this background work trying to get the landfills kind of up to speed on what needs to happen there. Just understand too that we, probably for a lot of you on this call too, many of us have spoken to landfills in our areas. Maybe they're interested, but again, as a federal entity, we cannot issue a contract until we have an actual need. So we can't do any of that work in advance with landfills. We can give them general guidelines, but we can't have an actual contract for services unless there's a need for it. And so then once you have that list of suitable landfills in the planning stage, this is you just kind of having conversations, maybe a landfill agreeing. We've got a county in Florida that they've agreed to take up to 1 million birds. Waste Management in South Florida said they take 1.5 million. So even having these discussions in advance helps tremendously. So if you can identify those in the planning stage, and then make sure that they've agreed to accept the infected material following the guidelines. And then that's when you want to get with your state environmental protection to make sure that they don't have any violations on the books. And do you have proper permitting to do that? Do they need to make modifications to working faces on there? Doing all of this prior to awarding contracts. And then in some cases, the landfills may request indemnity. I believe the state of Iowa, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but the state of Iowa agreed to pay some indemnity last year. Is that right, Lori? When we as a federal agency, we can't do that. We can't provide indemnity to a private company saying that they are held harmless. So states may be willing to provide that indemnity, and that's just on an individual basis.
And just to add to that, Joanna, yes, so Iowa was, landfills in Iowa were asking the federal government to provide indemnity. We were not able to do that, but the governor was able to give some sort of protection to a county landfill who was the first one, which was the first one to accept material, and then a private landfill also opened up.
Okay. And on the next slide, with your preparations, just ensuring that your contract personnel are prepared to award the contracts. This is in our contracting office, and then to be able to pay contractors and landfill operators once the invoices are approved. Whether it's someone from the INT, the disposal group, along with the contractors to do a site assessment and determine if access road improvements are needed. Coordinate with the landfill operator to have your traffic plan in place for trucks and other vehicles. In many cases, you may need to stabilize the roadways at the landfill. As it is now, many of them are just dirt roads, and so in some cases, they may need to put down temporary roads and mats to get them up there to support the weight of the trucks coming in. Selecting a suitable location at the landfill for vehicle cleaning and disinfection is important too, because from the wastewater that comes off, they in many cases would need to have a collection system for that wastewater. And then also developing or enhancing your vector control program. So most landfills have that in place, and they would just work with the IMT or the disposal group to shore that up as well. The next slide. The operations on the infected farm. This is getting a little bit in the weeds, but you can use as a reference. Have your single point of contact between the farm and the landfill. This might be your site manager. When the truck arrives at the farm, they need to remain in the vehicle from start to finish. You want to line the trailer or the roll-off with the PVC or other plastic sheeting, and you'll see the specs on there. And then you would have that lining in there. Then you could put something like a biozip bag in there, put the carcasses in there, and then seal it up again. You put 1 foot of absorbent material like wood shavings at the bottom of the bag to absorb any liquid that may leak. And then you also leave that foot of headspace at the top for expansion of material and for gas release. And then once that's sealed, you want to spray with disinfectant. Then put your tarp over the top of the container before leaving the farm. Clean and disinfect everything before they leave the farm, and then give the truck driver all of the appropriate paperwork, manifests, and everything to begin transport to the landfill, and then let the landfill know that they're coming. This is on the next slide. Give the estimated time of arrival, and then the trucks often would have to arrive under either APHIS or state permit on a route specified by designated officials to avoid other farms en route. And in some cases last year, they were able to waive the weight restrictions, the over-road weight restrictions too, so that they could carry heavier loads to the landfill. So the truck arrives at the landfill, it checks in at the scale, they get the receipt. They would then proceed to the disposal area. Any problems reported to the site manager. Everyone's wearing their PPE. The trenches are excavated. They may have been done in advance if they know how much to expect. The back gate of the roll-off is opened up using heavy equipment. They tip the trailer, allowing the bio bag or other liner to slide into the trench. And then they would cover the bags with at least 2 feet of excavated trash. You may want to apply odor control products at this time. And I would say there too, on the excavation and the rolling off, some landfills wanted the bags breached and opened once they went in, and then others preferred to keep the bags closed. So I believe that that's kind of either a state or locality specific preference on there. And as we get the information back from SIA on the risk of AI in landfills, that may give us some more credence to do one or the other too. So then you would pull the truck forward for clean and disinfection, make sure that the wastewater is collected, maintain the vector control, and then just make sure that they manage leachate in accordance with permit conditions. And if it's a permitted landfill that's in good standing, they typically follow those. Next slide. And so then we just got pictures here of on-farm clean and disinfection of all parts. You'll see the roll-off there with the tarp being cleaned and disinfected. Then you see those temporary roads at the landfill that are being laid down. The trench is being excavated. In the lower left-hand corner, we've got the bags getting, tipped into the trench. And then the vehicles are getting cleaned and disinfected there at the landfill. So the next slide. And so this wraps up the first part of the talk right here, but I did want to let you guys know that this information came from the online learning modules that are due to come out soon from STOS. This is what Lori and those guys have been working on, and you can see there the other topics in addition to landfills that will be posted on the website too. It's emergency management tools, but it also talks about a variety of disposal options, rendering, incineration, compost, secure transport, biosecurity, burning, and burial. So those probably should be, I don't want to give it timeline because, it never kind of does that, but just wanted to let you guys know that this information should be out there soon. Okay. Now we've got somebody showing us their dental pad. So before we jump into questions, let me check my time on there. We've only got just, maybe try and get through this next one in about 10 minutes. Like I said, in this next presentation, this is the one that anybody can take to landfills or to your county commission just to talk about the importance of AI, why we would like to be able to use carcasses. And this is, again, specific to AI, but you can also tweak it. If you need to actually get the slide deck, just let me know and I can give you the PowerPoint to tweak if you need it for another disease as well. So again, this specifically talks about AI. I'm on the front page of the Landfills and Highly Pathogenic Avian Influenza Response from May of 2016. So the next slide, this goes through, and again, I'll go through these pretty quickly. Why does it matter? It's got the stats in there on how much money was spent, why we do these things in the first place. We've got a page of definitions. Because again, this is for an external audience. It gives definitions for many of our acronyms, talks about veterinary services, highly pathogenic avian influenza, PPE, zoonotic disease. The next page is how disease outbreaks are handled. What gives APHIS the authority to do this in many cases in the lead agencies. It tells the audience what a zoonotic disease actually is. Your next slide is what are the goals in an FAD outbreak, and this came from FADPREP. So again, this is for the external audience, why we care about this stuff and why we're trying to plan to try and contain these diseases in the first place. Your next slide. And then the next several slides just goes through poultry production in the United States, gives stats and numbers. So I'm just going to kind of jump through these kind of quickly. I don't know if anybody's following on the phone, but we're just going to go right on through talking about the different states and the kind of money that they generate. There it is. There's my home, #1 in broilers. And then we move on to turkeys here. I'm on the slide that's got number of turkeys raised in 2010. And the next slide is top turkey producing states. Then we've got these other charts about that. So just a lot of background on the poultry industry for this audience. How did we get here? Just a schematic graph of how we got high-path avian influenza in the United States in 2014 and then in 15. And then that yellow star on there is Indiana for 16. The next slide. And then just showing the audience the flyways for birds. The next slide. Oh, sorry. And then just another schematic of that's got the flyways, and then this you can see those little blue dots with the black in the center. That's going through the infected premises that we had. It's kind of hard to see on that because you've got blue dots over blue in the Mississippi flyway, but it's got the infected premises overlaid on that. Next slide. Again, just goes through some of the numbers on avian influenza findings. Your next slide. It just goes through the number of cases found in each of the states and the number of birds that were taken out. Next slide. The impact of such a disease that we had. Talking about the virus a little bit. Next slide. The trade implications from the 2014-15 HPAI outbreak goes through that there too. It talks about the trade bans, gives you a schematic map of why the economic impact is so bad and why we need to have these kinds of plans in place. Next slide. Talking about the 2016 outbreak in Indiana. Next slide. Public health is the next couple of slides. Does it pose a threat to humans? Didn't in this most recent outbreak. If you look on that CDC page, it does talk about H5 and H7 in other countries causing death, but it does clearly say that we've not had a case of humans in the United States. Next slide. And then this is our response poster. What happens after it's been detected goes through that poster for those that are following along. Next slide. The roles of landfills. So this is when we're really trying to, hit a home run with the landfills and with explaining with billions of birds, we really need a way to try and dispose of these carcasses. And so asking them, can you accept bird carcasses, any of the waste products that we've discussed, hatchery waste, any leftover feed, eggs and egg product, PPE, coveralls, clean and disinfection, or any combination of the above. Next slide. Management considerations at the landfill. Some of this we discussed in the earlier presentation. We already went through leachate management. And I do need to update that slide. It says summer of 2016. It may be this fall. You'll see the USDA report on risk of leachate. That's should be this fall. On operations and logistics, the working hours, scale operators, tracking the waste, tipping fees, billing, scheduling a delivery of waste using contractors at landfills, wastewater management. And then the big one too is a public relations and outreach. Is it a municipal solid waste landfill that a county or a city entity runs, or is it a private landfill that doesn't necessarily have to answer to their, they have their stakeholders, but they don't have the county that they necessarily have to hear from those that are around there. Doesn't mean that they won't at all, but it's a different operation altogether. And then accepting this waste can also help protect animal and human health. So we know that that's, kind of one of the positives is being able to do this. And then that they can always work with the public information officers with whichever entity is running the response. And then just considering the regulations and permits that have to go on. What permits are needed? What modifications might be needed? Will it be handled differently during an emergency or disease outbreak too? Your next slide. Using contractors at the landfills. And so as we know, last year, whether it's Clean Harbors or I think it was Gardner, any of those others, we relied a lot on them for a lot of the logistics for this and to get these things done. So we would be using contractors for equipment rentals, power sprayers, frac tanks, tents, personnel to do much of the operations that are there too. The landfill does need a system for weighing and tracking AI waste separately from their regular municipal solid waste. So that's an important part of it too. And then the landfill would bill the USDA or the contractor or the producer. So either USDA could hire the landfill. It could also be a contractor such as Clean Harbors, that maybe the producer hires Clean Harbors to do the work at their place, and then Clean Harbors contracts directly with the landfill, then they handle it. Or the producer can contract directly with the landfill too. I believe that that's what happened in Indiana in January, is that the Dangerous Contact, the layer farm that was out there, I didn't hear if Dan Harpster was on the phone or not, but it sounds like the producer kind of already had a relationship and had already been speaking to the landfill operator. And really, they got those birds depopulated into the landfill quickly. Indiana did a great job with that. And so that was strictly between the producer and the landfill. Then the producer would just submit charges for reimbursement on that as well. Next slide. So much of this, the planning and operations, we've covered in the first part of the slide too. But again, this is for your external audience, things for them to consider too. And then much of the rest of this is just pictures. So this is a good aerial view, I think, of a landfill that was in Iowa. And all of these pictures came from Becky Joniskin. That's with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, I think is the name of that one. It's IDEM in Indiana. But she's great. She provided a lot of this material and that we used in this as well. So you can see you've got the scale house, your decon station, and then you've got the boundary of the landfill where your trenches are, your decon station's at the back part of the landfill, and then you've got the road that goes all the way around. Your clean off, staging for some of your roll-offs on there too. All right, next slide. And then many of these, I'll just got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to kind of run through many of these pictures because I think a lot of this probably saw it firsthand last year. But again, this could be used for your county commissioners if you have to go and speak to them, just seeing kind of what the operations actually look like. There's your command area that you've got your PPE supplies, the office, on-site, truck and tire decontamination. I'm on the full roll-off staging area slide. And it's got a roll-off being tipped in the background. We've got the excavated disposal trench being dug in this one. Just more trenches being excavated. You'll see those roads. I mean, they're pretty sturdy on there too. Right now we're on the tailgate being unlatched, hot zone delineated by yellow caution tape. I'm a little bit disturbed. This man in the foreground, the other guys are wearing full PPE, and this guy that's standing just behind the yellow tape, he's wearing his yellow vest, but nothing else. But so our next slide. This is where they're preparing to tip the roll-off. They used a series of honks out there at this landfill. The next slide. Disposing the waste in the trench. That roll-off is being tipped back. You see that the door was opened by the heavy machinery and then it's being tipped. Next slide. In this particular one, it's state or locality specific whether or not those bags are breached when they're put in the trench. The next one, you see that you've got that constructed road out there, and then you've got contractors cleaning and disinfecting roll-offs after tipping. The next slide. Truck and tire decon next to the hot zone. We've got our decontamination station. The next slide is the decon of roll-offs, just again showing pictures of that. I'm trying to remember that there's a little bit of delay between slides and not get too far ahead. And you can see there too, you've got your water tank over there, and then that's getting pumped into a frac tank for offsite disposal. Next slide. Again, deconning the tarp. Next slide, it's removing the liner and deconning that and then disposing of it in the landfill with other contaminated PPE. The next slide, we've got our wooden crane mats. I'm just going to jump through these really quickly. Your roads are being built on there, more wooden crane mats. Next slide. Your odor control products and the mister unit that's used for that. So that's just blown over there. Next slide. And then the fire truck decon at the facility exit. Next slide. So some of the bigger challenges in the 2015 outbreak, it was new to all of us. And so the landfills were concerned about the infected leachate getting into the environment and them having liability for it. The protection of the operators at the landfill, the public opposition and public perception of everything, and the potential lawsuits. So APHIS and many state DNRs, like I said, Becky with Indiana, Lori, they all work together to develop this waste acceptance criteria to address these operational issues. And then APHIS, primarily again, Lori, CDC, and NIOSH developed safety guidelines for operators. And then they did develop also frequently asked questions for the public. That's also posted on the FADPrep site too. And then, like we discussed before, the landfill companies did request federal indemnification, but by law we couldn't do that. So that's where the state of Iowa stepped up and did provide indemnification for those landfills. The next slide. So the lessons learned, which is why we're doing this kind of stuff now, is to educate people before a disease outbreak. Educate the public, educate the landfill operators, your county commissioners, anyone who could be in that decision-making process. Let them know now. That's why we did this presentation, so that it could be taken out, so that it takes away some of that fear factor when people are trying to decide. And because of the potential volume of birds and the waste material, these large landfills are really just ideal for taking many of these carcasses too. And again, this is just for birds. This is not even getting into potential F&D situation too. And in many cases, we had the states, especially in Iowa, Indiana, they worked to modify transportation and weight Minnesota. They worked to modify the weight restrictions, allowing larger loads to be hauled, and then they were rerouted. Again, make sure that you keep all the documentation separate from HPAI waste versus everyday waste. We don't want to be paying for their everyday stuff too. Keep in mind the weather, the road conditions, and extra equipment needed. I'd already gone home last year before all those really, really bad storms hit Iowa, when they had the wind and the rain just for weeks and weeks. And then working with the PIOs and the IMTs to craft appropriate messaging. Next slide. So again, this is making your pitch to landfill. So anyone interested, here's all the considerations: your worker safety, establishing SOPs for accepting waste that'll be beneficial to your operation, but still complying with the guidelines with the state. Supplying contractors, USDA can do that, the producer can do that, to bring in those roll-offs and trucks to assist in tipping and cleaning. That's where those contractors will be very useful. And then again, there's that point down there in italics. The landfill can be hired either by the state or federal government. It can also be hired by a contractor or by the poultry grower company itself. And then they would just send that in as well for their reimbursement. And then again, external audits will work with you, the landfills or county commission, to manage public perception and prepare for town hall meetings if needed. And again, they can provide a valuable public service, putting that positive spin on it too. Next slide. And then if they're interested, this is how they can get on SAM and get their DUNS number. And then the second to last slide here, more information about landfills. It's got the hyperlinks to those sites too. And does have the hyperlink there for the guideline for landfill workers from the CDC. And then just ask them, reach out to your state departments of agriculture, USDA, or your poultry producers to let them know if you're a landfill and are interested in doing this. Oh, and then the final slide, a little curious chicken. And then again, I can get you the actual PowerPoint if you want to use that, and then you put your information in there too. Okay, whew. All right, 3 minutes to go. All right, if I've got anybody left, I'm going to swap screens here.
You do. There's at least 11 recorded plus another folks, so no worries.
Okay. All right.
Have you taken
So any questions on any of that? And I went through fast, but we can always provide that.
Is it off mute?
We can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you. Maybe just a little louder. It sounds like Sherry, maybe.
It is, but I don't know where to even talk to because I've never. It did go really well.
I can hear you pretty good.
Yeah, you're better now. When you just said the last words, you must have been closer to the mic. Yeah.
Okay. It was a beautiful presentation. Thank you. But there was just one thing that concerned me a little bit, that if we tell people, because I do logistics, I can tell you that and I do the finance part. So when you get in there, and if we have a contractor that does that signs on with the landfill, that's going to cost us a heck of a lot more money. It'd be much better if USDA contracts directly with the landfill, if we can make that happen, or the producer. That was my only concern about the information you gave. Everything else was 100% usable, and I really need a lot of that information because we're not talking about that with our logistics people, and every one of them, that should be one of the first things that they start thinking about and planning for, and talking to the plans people and the ops people about right away, especially when we get these layer facilities.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. And I agree with you on that for the contractor. You know, we had conversations with Herbert too, and it started with no, it's only USDA. And then, you know, we had producers that they were already talking to him. So I didn't really relate in the slide, and maybe I could go back and change that. That's kind of our last ditch effort, is if someone like, you know, Gardner, Viola, Clean Harbors, if they were the in between. So yeah, I agree with you on that one. That's kind of our last choice. But it's easier if we do it the other way too.
God help us if Clean Harbors is our best choice on any situation.
Well, in case you didn't know, they have many of their own landfills located all around the country. So they would love for us to contract with them for that.
I know they would. There's a lot of that stuff, Joanna, I'm going to beg for, so that I can, because I'm putting together a whole list of dues when we first get into a situation, the first team out, and that is one of them, and that's such a huge one, and I completely forgot it. So I just didn't even think about, because every time we've been able, on the incidents I was on, most of the time we were able to compost right there or in a neighboring area. Never, I just have not talked to them about this, so I really.
Oh yeah, I'm glad to do it. And if you know, I think that we shared the PDF, but I've got the PowerPoint version. And I think that y'all on logs had spoken to Lori about doing some other presentations strictly for logs. So we can do this one as well and include that along with the logs presentations or any of the IMT stuff. I know y'all are getting together later in August. So yeah, happy to do any of that stuff.
Okay, great.
Great. We can certainly keep going for those who need to go. We understand you need to go. I know a couple folks dropped off already. Several folks now, but is there anyone else on the line that has any questions for Joanna? Which was an awesome presentation, by the way. I was laughing at one of your last slides because it was a backhoe and it had a sheet on it. I think slide 70. It reminded me of Casper the Ghost or Ghostbusters I just saw this weekend. But is there any other questions anybody has?
Yeah, try not to put too much of my humor and corny stuff in there because you never know who's on there.
yeah, but I liked it. I thought it was cool.
But yeah, for those that are left, I did want to remind y'all next week on Lori's talk, then she's going to get even more into the weeds. So Sherry, if you've got any logs people that want to get on about some of the, you know, I won't say the mess that we ran into last year, but some of the considerations we have to go through in the waste profile sheets and the liability. So that's going to be next week's topic too for those that are remaining on there.
Perfect. I will let them know. I was hoping.
And like I said, we can always do. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
I was hoping Diane Norden could join today, but she was on another call, I guess, because her door was shut. So.
Yeah, and the TEP call was also going on at the same time. And then she may have been, when I did that Fireside Friday a couple weeks ago, she may have been on that. But like I said, we can always go through and do this again for the logs folks. I'm happy to do any of that stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah, maybe a working group thing.
That would be very.
Oh, yeah. Glad to do that.
Kenny, don't let me forget that. Let's bring that up on the next.
Oh, I won't. And Dr. J always keeps me in good line and inspired and smart, so I won't forget her or you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
I got to get on another call. Thank you again, Joanna.
Okay.
sure.
All right.
Glad y'all got on. Thanks, Kenny.
Yeah,
thanks everyone.
everybody. You're welcome. Yeah, like I said, this is recorded, so we'll send it out soon once Blue Jeans gets it back to us. And everyone have a blessed and a good day. And thanks again, Joanna, for an excellent presentation and for everybody showing up.